Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter at Murphy's Diner for the third time that morning, her sleeve riding up to reveal the intricate tattoo that covered most of her left forearm. The design was unlike anything most people had seen before. A complex pattern of symbols, numbers, and what appeared to be coordinates woven together with military insignia that seemed to tell a story only she understood. "Hey, freak show," called out Jake Morrison from booth 3, his voice carrying across the small restaurant. "You planning on serving our food sometime today? Or are you too busy showing off that ridiculous ink?" Sarah's jaw tightened, but she maintained her professional composure. At 28 years old, she had learned to develop thick skin working at the diner in the small coastal town of Millfield. The morning rush brought in the usual crowd of construction workers, local business owners, and tourists heading to the nearby beach. Unfortunately, it also brought in people like Jake and his crew, who seemed to find entertainment in making her life difficult. "Coming right up," Sarah replied evenly, grabbing the coffee pot and heading toward their table. As she poured Jake's coffee, she noticed his eyes fixated on her tattoo with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. "What kind of woman ruins her body like that?" Jake continued, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Looks like some kind of gang marking or prison tattoo. Maybe we should be worried about having someone like that handling our food." The other customers began to turn and stare. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks but continued pouring coffee with steady hands. She had dealt with this kind of ignorance before, though it never got easier. What these people didn't understand was that every line, every symbol on her arm, represented something sacred to her. Memories she would carry forever, promises she had made, and sacrifices that had changed the course of her life. "Actually," chimed in Rebecca Walsh, a local real estate agent who frequented the diner, "I think it's quite artistic, though I do wonder what it all means. Those symbols look almost military." Jake snorted. "Military? Her? Look at her. She probably got it done at some sketchy parlor downtown. Probably doesn't even know what half of it means." Sarah set the coffee pot down on their table with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. "Will there be anything else?" "Yeah." Jake leaned back in his seat with a smirk. "How about you tell us the story behind that monstrosity on your arm? Did you lose a bet? Or something?" Before Sarah could respond, the bell above the diner's front door chimed, and she looked up to see 3 men in crisp military uniforms entering the establishment. The sight of them made her heart skip a beat. Not from fear, but from a complex mixture of emotions she thought she had buried long ago. The man leading the group was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples, and the kind of bearing that commanded respect without saying a word. His uniform indicated he was Navy, and the insignia on his chest suggested high rank. Behind him followed 2 younger servicemen, both carrying themselves with the disciplined posture of active duty personnel. "Table for 3, please," the older man said politely to Sarah, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Of course, right this way," Sarah replied, leading them to a booth near the window. As they walked, she was acutely aware that Jake and his friends were still watching her, probably preparing another round of comments about her appearance. As the military men settled into their seats, Sarah handed them menus and filled their water glasses. The older officer, she could see from his name tag that he was Commander Phillips, studied the menu, while his companions discussed something in low voices about their upcoming training exercises. "I'll have the breakfast special," Commander Phillips said when Sarah returned with her notepad. "And could I get that coffee black?" "Certainly. And for you, gentlemen?" Sarah addressed the other 2 servicemen, who ordered quickly and efficiently. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, she heard Jake's voice boom across the restaurant again. "Hey, Commander!" Jake called out, apparently emboldened by the presence of what he assumed were like-minded individuals. "You guys might want to keep an eye on your waitress there. She's got some pretty suspicious tattoos. Looks like the kind of markings you'd see on enemy combatants or gang members." Sarah froze mid-step, her face burning with embarrassment and anger. She had endured Jake's harassment for months, but involving customers, especially military personnel, in his cruel commentary felt like a new low. Commander Phillips looked up from his menu, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "Yeah," Jake continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "Take a look at her arm next time she comes by. Weird symbols, coordinates, military-looking stuff. Pretty suspicious if you ask me. Makes you wonder what kind of background check they did before hiring her here." The commander's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He exchanged a quick glance with his companions, who had stopped their conversation and were now listening intently. "Coordinates, you said?" Commander Phillips asked, his voice carefully controlled. "That's right. And all sorts of other military mumbo-jumbo. Probably trying to look tough or something. You know how these types are. Always trying to play soldier when they've never served a day in their lives." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her notepad. The irony of Jake's words cut deep, but she knew that defending herself would only make the situation worse. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the people around you had already made up their minds about who you were based on appearances alone. Commander Phillips stood up slowly, his movement drawing the attention of everyone in the diner. "Excuse me, miss," he called to Sarah. "Could you come here for a moment?" Sarah's heart pounded as she approached the table. She braced herself for more humiliation, wondering if the commander was going to ask her to explain her tattoos or, worse, ask the manager to have her removed from their section. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Could you please show me your left arm?" Commander Phillips asked, his voice gentle but authoritative. The diner fell completely silent. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the restaurant focused on her as she slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing the full extent of her tattoo. The intricate design covered her forearm from wrist to elbow, a masterpiece of black ink that told a story most people would never understand. Commander Phillips studied the tattoo for a long moment, his trained eyes taking in every detail. Sarah watched as his expression changed from curiosity to recognition, to something that looked almost like reverence. His two companions leaned forward to get a better look, and she saw their faces transform as well. The silence in the diner stretched on, broken only by the soft hum of the coffee machine and the distant sound of traffic outside. Jake and his friends watched expectantly, probably waiting for the commander to validate their assumptions about Sarah's character. Instead, Commander Phillips did something that no one in the restaurant expected. He stood up straighter, brought his heels together, and rendered a perfect military salute to Sarah Martinez, former Navy Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class, holder of the Purple Heart, and survivor of one of the most devastating attacks on a forward operating base in recent military history. The entire diner erupted in shocked whispers and confused murmurs as Jake's confident smirk slowly faded from his face, replaced by a look of dawning horror as he began to realize that he might have made a terrible mistake. Sarah stood frozen in place, her sleeve still rolled up, staring at Commander Phillips as he held his salute. The sight of the respected naval officer showing her this level of respect sent a flood of emotions through her that she had been suppressing for years. Slowly, instinctively, her own hand came up to return the salute, muscle memory taking over despite the civilian clothes she now wore. The two men held their salutes for several seconds while the entire diner watched in stunned silence. When they finally lowered their hands, Commander Phillips stepped closer to Sarah, his voice soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Corpsman Martinez," he said, using her former rank and title. "It's an honor." Jake's face had gone completely white. The other customers looked confused, turning to each other with questioning expressions. But Jake seemed to understand that something significant was happening, even if he didn't grasp the full implications yet. "You know her?" asked one of the younger servicemen, with Commander Phillips. "I know of her," the commander replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Every Navy SEAL knows her story. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Sarah Martinez, attached to SEAL Team 7 during Operation Enduring Freedom. She saved the lives of 12 men during an ambush at Forward Operating Base Chapman." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for years. Hearing her story told by someone who understood its significance felt like a dam breaking inside her chest. She had grown so accustomed to hiding this part of herself, to pretending that the most important chapter of her life had never happened. 12 lives, Commander Phillips continued, his voice gaining strength, when insurgents overran their position with rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons fire. Corpsman Martinez exposed herself to enemy fire repeatedly to reach wounded SEALs. She provided medical treatment under fire for over 2 hours, refusing evacuation until every last man was stabilized. The diner had become so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She noticed that several customers had pulled out their phones, probably looking up her story online. The expression on Jake's face had progressed from confusion to what looked like genuine fear as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The coordinates on her tattoo, Commander Phillips continued, turning slightly so his voice would carry to Jake's table, are the exact location of FOB Chapman. The symbols represent the call signs of the 12 men she saved. The dates mark the day of the attack and the day she was awarded the Purple Heart for wounds sustained while treating others. Sarah touched her arm unconsciously, running her fingers over the ink that she had commissioned from a military tattoo artist who specialized in memorial work. Each symbol had been carefully researched and designed to honor the men who had trusted her with their lives in the worst possible circumstances. She was shot 3 times during that engagement, the commander added, his voice growing more serious. Once in the shoulder, once in the leg, and once in the abdomen. She continued treating wounded personnel with a sucking chest wound, using her own medical supplies and improvising treatment with whatever materials she could find. Rebecca Walsh, the real estate agent who had earlier defended Sarah's tattoo as artistic, was now openly staring with her mouth agape. Other customers were nodding with newfound respect. And Sarah could see some of the construction workers looking ashamed of their earlier lack of intervention when Jake was harassing her. "But why is she working here?" asked one of the younger servicemen. "Someone with her record should be." "Should be what?" Sarah spoke for the first time since the commander had begun telling her story, her voice steady despite the emotions coursing through her. "Should be able to transition seamlessly back to civilian life? Should be immune to PTSD? Should be guaranteed employment? Based on military service?" The questions hung in the air, highlighting truths that many people preferred not to think about. Sarah had struggled for years after her medical discharge, dealing with physical pain from her wounds, psychological trauma from the attack, and the frustration of being treated like a charity case by potential employers who saw her military service as either irrelevant or potentially problematic. "The truth is," Sarah continued, "I've been working here for 8 months because it's the first place that hired me without asking a lot of questions about my past or treating me like I might snap at any moment. Mr. RD7 Large, Murphy gave me a job when I needed one, and I've been grateful for it every single day." Commander Phillips nodded with understanding. "The transition can be difficult. Too many veterans fall through the cracks. Especially female veterans," Sarah added. "People see the tattoos and assume the worst. They don't see years of medical training, experience working under pressure, or dedication to service. They just see someone who doesn't fit their idea of what a woman should look like." Jake had been listening to this exchange with growing mortification. He seemed to shrink further into his booth with each revelation, as if he could somehow disappear entirely if he made himself small enough. His friends had distanced themselves from him, literally scooting away along the booth's bench seat. "Ma'am," Jake called out suddenly, his voice cracking slightly. I need to apologize." The diner turned to look at him as he struggled to find words adequate for the situation he had created. Sarah could see that he was genuinely shaken. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I had no idea," Jake continued. "I said terrible things about you, about your service, about your sacrifice. There's no excuse for it." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing her response. Part of her wanted to accept his apology gracefully and move on. But another part of her was tired of making things easy for people who judged others without taking the time to understand them. "The problem, Jake," she said finally, "isn't that you didn't know I was a veteran. The problem is that you felt entitled to mock and humiliate someone based on their appearance, regardless of their background. You would have been just as wrong if I had been a civilian with tattoos who simply liked the way they looked. Jake nodded miserably, unable to meet her eyes. But I do appreciate the apology, Sarah continued. And I hope this experience helps you think differently about making assumptions about people. Commander Phillips had been observing this exchange with interest. Corpsman Martinez, he said. Might I have a word with you privately? When you have a moment? Sarah nodded, then looked around the diner. The atmosphere had completely changed from when she had started her shift. Customers who had previously ignored her were now looking at her with respect and curiosity. The kitchen staff had emerged to listen to the story, and even Mr. Murphy had come out from his office to see what was happening. Let me get your orders to the kitchen first, Sarah said to the 3 servicemen. Then we can talk. As she walked toward the kitchen, Sarah became aware that something fundamental had shifted in her world. For years, she had kept her military service private, partly to avoid unwanted attention, and partly to protect herself from people who might treat her differently once they knew her history. She had grown tired of being seen as either a hero to be pitied or a potential problem to be avoided. But now, standing in the middle of Murphy's diner, with her story finally told, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that she might be able to stop hiding who she really was. The cook, an elderly man named Tony, who had always been kind to her, took the order slip from her hand and squeezed her shoulder gently. I knew there was something special about you, kiddo, he said quietly. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. Sarah smiled at him, then took a deep breath and prepared to have the conversation that might change the trajectory of her life once again. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Commander Phillips at a quiet corner table while his companions waited outside by their vehicle. The lunch rush was beginning to pick up, but Mr. Murphy had insisted that Tony and the other staff could handle things while Sarah took her break. I have to ask, Commander Phillips began, stirring sugar into his coffee. What brought you to Millfield? This seems like an unusual place for someone with your background to end up. Sarah considered her answer carefully. She had become accustomed to deflecting personal questions, but something about the commander's genuine interest and respectful approach made her want to be honest. After my medical discharge, I spent 2 years trying to make it work in bigger cities, she explained. Boston. Then Philadelphia. I had this idea that urban areas would have more opportunities, better VA support, more understanding of veterans. But everywhere I went, I felt like I was drowning. She paused, remembering those difficult months of job interviews where potential employers seemed uncomfortable with her military background, therapy sessions that felt inadequate, and the constant noise and chaos of city life that triggered her hypervigilance. I was driving through Millfield about a year ago, just passing through on my way to nowhere in particular, and my car broke down right outside this diner. Mr. Murphy let me wait inside while the mechanic worked on it, didn't charge me for the coffee, and we got to talking. He told me about how quiet it was here, how people generally minded their own business, and how he was looking for reliable help. Commander Phillips nodded, understanding more than Sarah had actually said. Sometimes, the best healing happens in unexpected places. Exactly. I've had more peace in this little town than I had in years of trying to fit back into what I thought my life should look like. Until today, anyway. Sarah gestured toward Jake's table, where he was still sitting with his head down, picking at his food. Today might actually be a turning point for you, the commander said thoughtfully. I have a proposition, but I want you to hear me out completely before you respond. Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. I run a program through the VA that places experienced military medical personnel in civilian positions where their skills can be put to the best use. We work with hospitals, emergency services, disaster relief organizations, even private security firms that need qualified medical support. I've heard about those programs, Sarah said carefully. Most of them want people who are ready to jump back into high-stress situations. I'm not sure that's where I am right now. Rady 3. I'm not sure that's where I am right now. That's exactly why I think you might be perfect for what I have in mind, Commander Phillips replied. There's a position opening up at the Coast Guard station, about 30 minutes north of here. They need someone to run their medical training programs for new recruits and provide emergency medical support during search and rescue operations. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Coast Guard? Coast Guard. It's not active duty, the commander explained quickly. You'd be a civilian contractor, working normal hours most of the time, with occasional on-call requirements during major rescue operations. The position would let you use your medical training without the combat stress, and you'd be working with people who understand military culture. The idea was appealing, but Sarah had learned to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Why me? You don't even know my current qualifications, or what kind of shape I'm in medically. I know your record, Commander Phillips said, and I can see that you're sharp, composed under pressure, and still have the bearing of someone who knows how to handle responsibility. But more importantly, I can see that you've found a way to build a life for yourself without losing who you are at your core. He gestured toward her tattoo, which was still visible since she hadn't rolled her sleeve back down. Someone who carries their service with them like that? Who honors their brothers and sisters in arms, permanently on their skin, doesn't lose their commitment to helping others. They just need the right opportunity to do it again. Sarah looked around the diner, taking in the familiar surroundings that had become her refuge. The idea of leaving terrified her almost as much as it excited her. What about this place? Mr. Murphy has been good to me. Think about it this way, Commander Phillips said. You've spent 8 months proving to yourself that you can hold down a job and function in civilian society. That's not nothing, but the question is whether you want to spend the rest of your life hiding your light under a bushel, or whether you're ready to step back into who you really are. Before Sarah could respond, she noticed Jake approaching their table, his face pale but determined. Commander Phillips turned to see what had caught her attention. Excuse me, Jake said nervously, addressing both of them. I wanted to apologize again. Properly this time. And I wanted you to know that I called my brother. He's a Marine veteran, and I told him what happened here today. He's driving down from Portland to help me understand how I can do better. Sarah was surprised by the genuine effort Jake seemed to be making. That's actually really thoughtful of you, Jake. My brother always said I ran my mouth too much without thinking about how my words affected people. Today proved him right in the worst possible way. I want to learn how to be better than that. Commander Phillips extended his hand to Jake. That takes courage, son. Admitting when you're wrong and taking steps to change is more than a lot of people ever do. Jake shook the commander's hand gratefully, then turned back to Sarah. If you ever need anything at all, please let me know. I owe you more than I can ever repay. After Jake returned to his table, Commander Phillips continued his conversation with Sarah. You see? You're already making a difference just by being who you are. Imagine what you could accomplish in a position where that's actually your job. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes again. But this time, they were tears of possibility, rather than pain. For the first time in years, she could envision a future that honored both her past service and her current need for stability. I'd need time to think about it, she said finally. Of course, here's my card. Commander Phillips reached into his jacket pocket. The position doesn't need to be filled for another 6 weeks, so you have time to make sure it's right for you. As they stood to shake hands, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere in the diner had permanently shifted. Customers who had witnessed the earlier exchange were treating her with visible respect. Some had even approached Mr. Murphy to tell him how lucky he was to have such an outstanding employee. There's one more thing, Commander Phillips said as they reached the door. I want you to know that what happened here today, the way you handled yourself, the dignity you showed even when you were being treated poorly, that's exactly the kind of leadership we need in positions like this. The military taught you skills, but your character is what makes you exceptional. After the commander and his men left, Sarah found herself standing at the counter, looking out the window at the small coastal town that had become her sanctuary. Mr. Murphy approached her, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand that she might be considering other opportunities. "You know, I'd hate to lose you," he said gently. "But if there's something out there that's better for you, I want you to take it. You've been good to this place, and this place should be good to you too." Sarah smiled at the older man who had given her a chance when she needed it most. "Whatever happens, I'll never forget what you did for me." "What I did was hire a good employee," Mr. Murphy replied with a grin. "Everything else, you did yourself." As Sarah finished her shift that day, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. She had spent so long focused on simply surviving each day that she had forgotten what it felt like to have goals and dreams that extended beyond basic stability. That evening, sitting in her small apartment above the local bakery, Sarah examined her tattoo by lamplight. Each symbol and date told the story of the most important day of her life, when she had discovered exactly what she was capable of under the worst possible circumstances. For too long, she had seen it as a reminder of trauma and loss. But now, thanks to an unexpected encounter with someone who understood its true meaning, she was beginning to see it as a map pointing toward who she could become. She picked up Commander Phillips's business card and set it on her kitchen table where she would see it every morning. Tomorrow, she would call the Coast Guard station to learn more about the position. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah Martinez fell asleep feeling hopeful about tomorrow. The small coastal town of Millfield had given her the peace she needed to heal. Now, it was time to discover whether she was ready to step back into the world and continue the work she had always been meant to do.